The late afternoon sun hung low over the dry Texas horizon, casting long shadows across the dirt-stained auction yard. The air was thick with dust and sweat, and the restless murmur of cattlemen filled the wooden bleachers. Then came the creak of iron hinges, and all noise seemed to stop for a moment. A horse was led into the ring, lean, battered, and trembling slightly. His coat was a deep chestnut, but no one noticed that. All eyes went straight to his hind legs, crooked, turned inward as if he'd grown up wrong. Whispers rose, then laughter. "Lord have mercy," someone muttered. "That poor thing couldn't chase a turtle down a slope." Another man spat into the dirt. "Might as well sell him for glue." The auctioneer, Vernon Clay, tried to stay professional, though his voice was worn from a long, thankless day. "We got here a fine-blooded gelding. Solid build, gentle nature, strong heart. He's got 2 left feet and a death wish," someone shouted, sending a new wave of laughter through the crowd. The horse jolted, ears pinned back, but stayed still. His eyes scanned the ring, wide, unsure, wounded. Not just from fear, but from knowing he didn't belong. Not here. Not anywhere. In the back corner of the bleachers, unnoticed at first, sat a man with worn-out boots and a quiet stare. Aidan Callahan. A widower. A man who once had land, pride, and a family. Now he lived in the shadow of memories and the hum of broken things. He didn't speak. He didn't scoff. He just watched that horse like he recognized something in him, something no one else bothered to see. The auctioneer sighed. $5. That's all I'm a skin. 5 to start. Anyone? The crowd grew quiet, not out of sympathy, but boredom. Then came Aidan's voice. "Come." Gravelly. Unshaken. 5. Heads turned. Eyes narrowed. "Callahan?" Someone laughed. "You buyin' that crippled thing? You got a death wish too, or just lonely out there on that sad little patch of dirt?" Aidan stood. Said nothing. He walked slowly to the ring, eyes locked with the horse's. The horse didn't flinch. In fact, for the first time, he stopped trembling. The gavel came down with a hollow thud. "Sold. $5. To Mr. Callahan." There was no applause. Only whispers and smirks. But what they didn't know was that Aidan hadn't just bought a broken horse. He'd made a choice. One that would echo far louder than anyone could have imagined. The old pickup rumbled down the gravel road as the sun dipped below the hills, casting a faded orange glow across the windshield. Aidan Callahan drove in silence, the dust from the auction yard still clinging to his boots and the sleeves of his denim shirt. In the trailer behind him, the horse, now his, stood uncertain, shifting his weight as the wheels bumped over uneven ground. He hadn't given the animal a name yet. Something about that felt sacred, like naming a wound before you understood how deep it went. His ranch, once lively and full of sound, now sat in quiet decay. The wooden gate hung crooked on its hinges, and the barn leaned like an old man who'd stopped resisting time. As he backed the trailer up to the paddock, the wind caught a loose shingle on the roof, slapping it like a warning. Aidan climbed down from the cab and walked around, his boots crunching the dry dirt. He opened the trailer gate slowly and stepped aside, giving the animal space. The horse didn't bolt. He stepped out carefully, almost too carefully, like every movement had been judged before. Aidan watched, arms folded, jaw set. "You're not the only one they gave up on," he muttered. "So don't expect gold and ribbons here. Just quiet. And maybe something better." He led the horse to a small pen near the barn, a place he hadn't used in years. As the animal limped inside, Aidan leaned on the fence, staring at those crooked legs. He thought of Nolan, his son, who hadn't spoken to him in 5 years. The last time they argued, it ended with a slammed door and the sound of tires spitting gravel. Aidan had watched that truck disappear the same way this horse had walked out of the trailer, with pain, but no fight left to hide it. Inside the house, the air was still and hollow. A photo of Eliza Ray sat on the mantel, the frame slightly tilted, as if time had worn even her memory. Aidan stood in front of it for a moment, then looked out the window toward the barn. He hadn't expected company, especially not the kind that came with a limp and a history no one wanted to hear. But something about the silence that followed the horse's arrival felt different. Less empty. That night, Aidan didn't sleep much. Outside, the wind rustled the grass, and somewhere in the darkness, a soft whinny broke the quiet. It wasn't fear. It wasn't pain. It was something else. Recognition, maybe. Or the fragile beginning of trust. And far out on that forgotten ranch, two broken things had started to heal, even if neither of them knew it yet. The morning came gray and cold, the kind that settles in your bones before the sun even has a chance to warm the soil. Aidan stepped onto the porch with a steaming mug of black coffee and looked toward the barn. The wind was still, but the silence wasn't comforting. It was watchful, like the land was waiting to see what kind of man he'd be today. He walked toward the pen, his boots sinking into patches of soft earth from last night's drizzle. The horse stood alone in the far corner, legs crooked, head low. He hadn't eaten much. Aidan had left fresh hay, but most of it was still untouched. "Not hungry, huh?" he said quietly, crouching down just outside the fence. The horse didn't move, but his ears twitched at the sound of Aidan's voice. It wasn't trust yet, but it wasn't fear either. Just that quiet space in between, where wounds go before they scar. He decided to call him Briggs, not after anyone, just a name that came to him as he watched the animal shift his weight again, stubborn and tired. Briggs. Short, strong, and not pretty, but it fit. Aidan said it aloud once, testing it like a secret he wasn't sure he should keep. "Briggs. That work for you?" The horse flicked his tail and turned his head slightly. It wasn't a yes, but it wasn't a no either. Later that day, Aidan wandered into the barn for the first time in months. Dust clung to the rafters, and cobwebs stretched between the tools that hadn't been touched since the summer Eliza passed. Her old saddle still hung on the wall, cracked with time but intact. He ran his hand along the leather, eyes distant. "You always said broken things deserve a second chance," he whispered. "Guess I'm finally listening." A noise behind him made him turn. Briggs had limped up to the barn door. He stood there, uncertain, as if asking for permission. Aidan opened the gate to the pen and stood back. The horse didn't move. Not at first. But then, slowly, he stepped forward. One hoof. Then another. Into the space where memories still clung to the air like smoke. That evening, as dusk painted the sky in strokes of ash and fire, Aidan sat beside the open barn door, watching Briggs graze. He didn't feel proud. He didn't feel fixed. But he felt something he hadn't in a long time. Present. The past was still there, whispering. But for now, it had quieted. And in that silence, a bond had begun to form, unspoken, fragile, and real. The next morning brought a knock on the front door, sharp, impatient. Aidan stood at the kitchen sink, halfway through washing a coffee mug, when he heard it. He dried his hands on a rag and opened the door to find Silas Bexley standing on his porch. The man's hat was clean, boots polished, and his smile sharp enough to cut through bone. "Heard you picked up a charity case at the auction," Silas said without waiting to be invited in. Aidan didn't answer right away. He just looked at Silas, then past him, toward the barn where Briggs stood in the morning light, chewing slowly. "What I buy is my business," Aidan said flatly, stepping outside and letting the screen door slam behind him. Silas chuckled, hands in his pockets. "Fair enough. Just seems strange. A man with no hired hands, no family around, suddenly spending money on a horse that can't even walk straight." There it was, the jab he expected. The one about being alone. Aidan kept his voice even. "Funny. Thought you were busy counting your own cattle, not mine. Silas's grin faded. You know, some of us were hoping you'd finally let that land go. Lot of folks think it's just wasted dirt now. Aidan's jaw clenched, but he didn't take the bait. This dirt's still mine. And it's not for sale. Silas let the silence stretch. Well, don't say we didn't offer. Would be a shame if something happened out here, this far from town. He turned and walked off, whistling as he went. Aidan stood there for a long time, watching the dust settle behind the man's truck as it disappeared down the road. The warning hadn't been subtle. And it wasn't the first time someone tried to push him off the land Eliza loved. Later, as he worked in the barn brushing Briggs' coat, his hands moved slowly, but his mind raced. The past was creeping in again, not just through memories, but through people who wanted to bury it. He remembered when he and Eliza first bought the place. They were going to raise horses, grow old in the sun. But life had other plans. And the land, now half dead, was all he had left to hold onto her. That night, he sat by the barn door again, listening to the cicadas and watching the stars. Briggs stood nearby, closer than before. Neither of them said anything, of course, they didn't need to. But in that silence, something unspoken passed between them. They were both being watched, and not everyone wanted them to heal. 3 days passed without another visit from Silas, but the tension in the air lingered like a storm that hadn't yet cracked. Aidan kept to his routine, feeding Briggs, clearing brush, fixing the barn roof, but something inside him had begun to stir. He hadn't heard from Nolan in nearly 6 years, but lately, his mind wandered there more than he liked to admit. Every movement of Briggs, cautious, limping, determined, reminded him of his son's last words, "You always try to fix things after it's too late." That afternoon, thick clouds rolled in from the west. The sky turned a muddy gray, and a sharp wind rattled the barn doors. Aidan hurried to tie down tools and secure the gates. Briggs stood uneasy in his pen, head tossing, sensing what was coming. Aidan approached him slowly, rope in hand, to lead him inside. "Come on, boy. Let's get you out of this," he said gently. But before he could secure the lead, a sudden crack of thunder spooked the horse. Briggs bolted, his back legs stumbling awkwardly in the mud. Aidan shouted and ran after him, slipping once but regaining balance. The horse's hooves skidded across the slick ground until one leg gave out completely, sending him down with a heavy, heart-stopping thud. Aidan dropped to his knees beside him. "Easy, easy!" His voice trembled as he pressed a hand to Briggs's neck, feeling the frantic pulse. The rain began to pour, soaking them both in seconds. For a moment, all Aidan could see was the broken look in Briggs's eyes, the same look Eliza had the night the ambulance pulled away. It took nearly an hour to get Briggs up and into the barn. Mud clung to his coat, and he leaned hard against the stall wall, shivering. Aidan stripped off his jacket, covering the animal's back, then stood beside him, soaked to the bone. Lightning lit up the inside of the barn in brief, violent flashes. And in those moments of silence between thunderclaps, Aidan felt something break open inside him. "This ain't just about the horse," he whispered aloud, almost ashamed to hear it. "I know that." He ran a hand through his wet hair and stared at the stall. "I couldn't save her. I couldn't reach Nolan. And now I'm out here talking to ghosts and horses that can't walk straight." But the horse didn't look broken anymore, just tired. Like he was waiting for someone to believe in him for real. And in that barn, soaked in rain and memory, Aidan realized he wasn't just trying to save Briggs. He was trying to save the parts of himself he thought were already gone. The rain passed overnight, but the cold stayed behind, settling into Aidan's joints like guilt. He moved slower the next morning, every muscle aching from the fight to get Briggs back on his feet. But as he approached the barn, he found the horse standing, legs shaky, but holding. Aidan leaned on the doorway, watching him chew slowly from the hay pile, steam rising off his back like a ghost lifting away. For the first time, he let a small smile form. "You're tougher than you look, Briggs." Inside the house, he pulled open the bottom drawer of his desk, the one he hadn't touched in years. Beneath old receipts and rusted keys was a stack of letters, bound with a cracked leather strap. Each envelope was addressed in the same handwriting. Aidan Callahan, sent from Dallas, unopened. Aidan stared at them for a long while, his hands trembling slightly. He'd written them all, birthdays, apologies, one letter after Eliza died. But he'd never had the courage to send a single one. A knock at the door startled him. Not sharp like Silas's, softer, uncertain. When he opened it, Clara Jo Whitlow stood on the porch in a tan coat, hair tucked into a scarf, her eyes kind but direct. "Heard about the horse," she said. "Thought you might need some liniment for the joints. Used to help my old mare when the cold came in." Aidan hesitated, then stepped aside. "Come in, then." They sat at the table, the silence between them comfortable, though full of things unsaid. Clara Jo glanced toward the living room. "You still keep her photo up?" Aidan nodded. "Some things you don't take down, even when they hurt." She reached across the table, fingers resting lightly on the stack of letters he hadn't bothered to hide. "You still love them both," she said. "That's not weakness, Aidan. That's what makes you human." Later that evening, Aidan walked out to the barn again, letters still in hand. He stood beside Briggs's stall, the dim light casting long shadows on the dirt floor. "You ever try to speak, and the words just sit in your throat like stones?" he said to the horse. "That's what all these are. Stones I never threw." Then he did something he hadn't done in years. He burned them, one by one, feeding the pages to a rusty old barrel behind the barn. Watching the flames, he didn't feel lighter. Not yet. But maybe, just maybe, he'd stopped carrying them alone. And behind him, in the barn, Briggs gave a soft, low nicker. Not pain, not fear. Just presence. It was just past noon when Aidan noticed the break in the fence. A section near the back pasture had been cleanly cut, not weathered, not chewed, but sliced with something sharp. He crouched near the wood, running his fingers along the splintered edge. No animal did this. It was deliberate. He stood slowly, jaw tightening. His land had been left alone for years, mostly because folks figured there wasn't anything worth stealing. But now, someone was testing boundaries. He didn't need to guess who. Silas Bexley had made himself clear enough. The man had always circled like a vulture, ever since Eliza's funeral. Aidan knew what he wanted: the land, the water rights, the quiet satisfaction of watching a broken man fold. And now that Aidan had something to protect again, it made him a target. Not just because of the land, but because hope, even a small, limping kind, makes people nervous. Back at the barn, Briggs was pacing. Not wildly, but with purpose. His injured leg dragged slightly, but he moved, more than Aidan had seen before. He seemed alert, agitated, like he knew something was off. "You feel it too, don't you?" Aidan said, stroking his neck. "Some folks don't need a reason to destroy things. Just an opportunity." That evening, as the sun dipped behind the hills, Aidan set out with his rifle slung over his shoulder. Not to shoot, just to be seen. Sometimes presence was its own warning. He walked the fence line slowly, boots crunching dry brush, eyes sharp. Near the creek, he found fresh boot prints. Heavy, deep. Someone had been watching, close. He followed them a few yards before they vanished into the thicket. No names. No faces. Just footsteps in the dirt and the quiet knowledge that he wasn't alone anymore. When he returned to the barn, Clara Jo's truck was parked outside. She stood by Briggs's stall, brushing the horse gently. "He's moving better," she said without looking up. "That limp isn't slowing him down like before." Aidan leaned against the doorway, grateful for the company. "He's got more fight in him than I thought." Clara smiled faintly. "So do you." But later, as the night deepened, Aidan sat on the porch with the rifle resting beside him. Not out of fear, out of preparation. The land was whispering again. And this time, it wasn't memories. It was something real. Something near. And deep down, he knew. The fight for this place, and for everything it meant, had just begun. The smell of smoke came just before dawn. Aidan had just put on the kettle when he caught it, faint but unmistakable, drifting through the cracked window above the sink. He dropped the mug and bolted out the back door, boots half-laced. The orange glow shimmered on the horizon beyond the west pasture. Fire. Fast and low, sweeping through dry grass like a curse. His heart pounded. That part of the land was closest to the barn. He grabbed a bucket, then the hose, heart racing. But the wind was wrong, pushing the flames in Briggs's direction. He ran, lungs burning, yelling the horse's name though he knew it was useless. Briggs wouldn't understand words. But maybe he'd understand fear. When Aidan reached the barn, the smoke was thicker. Briggs was pacing, eyes wide, whinnying loud enough to crack the silence of dawn. Aidan flung the stall door open. "Move!" he shouted, clapping his hands. "Out, boy, now!" And Briggs moved. He didn't limp. He ran. Not fast, not graceful, but determined, like something inside him had snapped loose. Aidan guided him out into the open field, away from the blaze. Then he turned back. He couldn't let the fire take the barn. Not after everything that had happened inside those walls. With soaked towels and the hose stretched as far as it would go, he fought the fire alone. It wasn't enough to put it out, but it was enough to slow it. By the time the sheriff's truck pulled up, Aidan was coughing in the dirt, face blackened with soot. Sheriff Amos Klein stood over him, eyes scanning the scorched field. "Someone set this," he said. "Not a question, a fact." Aidan nodded weakly. "Back fence was cut days ago." "I told no one." Amos looked toward the tree lean. "We'll find who did it. But you'd better be ready for it to get worse before it gets better." Later that evening, after the fire was out and the sun had returned like nothing had happened, Aidan stood beside Briggs under the wide Texas sky. The horse's legs were still bent, but his spirit wasn't. He'd run, when it counted. And so had Aidan. "Funny," he whispered, rubbing the side of Briggs's face. "They all thought you were broken. Guess they thought the same about me. But not anymore." The land had been scarred. The past was coming back with fire and force. But something in both of them had survived the heat. And whatever came next, neither one was running. 2 days after the fire, the land was quiet again. Not peaceful, but holding its breath. Charred grass left scars in the pasture, and the air still carried a faint scent of smoke. Aidan sat on the porch steps, staring into the distance, his knees aching and his knuckles raw. Briggs stood nearby, head lowered, grazing carefully. The worst had passed, but something inside Aidan told him it wasn't over. The sound of tires crunching gravel broke the stillness. A blue pickup, coated in city dust, pulled slowly into the driveway. Aidan stood, heart skipping. He hadn't seen that truck in nearly 6 years. When the door opened, Aidan Callahan stepped out, older now, his face leaner, eyes shaded by guilt. He didn't speak right away. Neither did Aidan. "I heard about the fire," Nolan said finally, voice quiet. "Sheriff Klein called me." Aidan nodded. "Didn't expect you." Nolan looked toward the barn, then to the pasture where Briggs stood watching, ears twitching. "You used to write me letters," he said, almost a whisper. "I kept them. Never opened them. But I couldn't throw them away either." Aidan cleared his throat, unsure what to say. "You were angry." I earned that. Nolan stepped forward. Maybe. But I left too fast. You lost Mom, and I just ran. I thought if I didn't see this place fall apart, it wouldn't hurt as much. Aidan blinked hard, swallowing the weight in his throat. I didn't know how to hold it together. Not the land. Not you. Not myself. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Then Nolan took a slow step toward the pasture. Is that him? He asked, pointing to Briggs. Aidan nodded. Bought him for $5. Everyone laughed. Nolan gave a faint smile. They always did. Father and son stood side by side, watching the crooked-legged horse graze on blackened grass. He's tougher than he looks, Aidan said. Nolan nodded. So are you. As dusk settled over the ranch, Nolan helped Aidan repair the back fence. They didn't talk much, but they didn't need to. The silence was different now. Full, not empty. Between hammers and nails, something long broken had started to mend. It wasn't a grand moment. Just two hands building again. And one stubborn horse watching like he understood more than either of them realized. Tomorrow would bring more work, more healing, more unknowns. But tonight, for the first time in years, the Callahan ranch felt alive again. Weeks passed, and spring slowly returned to the land. The scorched grass near the west pasture had started to grow again, small, stubborn blades pushing through blackened soil like quiet survivors. Aidan stood at the fence line with a hammer in hand, looking out across the field. Briggs was there, grazing steadily, his gait still imperfect but stronger with every step. The horse wasn't healed, not fully, but he wasn't broken either. Neither was Aidan. The ranch had changed. Fences were upright again. Tools put back in place. The porch had been cleaned, and the old wind chimes Eliza once hung were swaying in the breeze, singing a tune Aidan hadn't heard in years. Nolan was still there, not just in visits, but present. He rose early, worked late, and for the first time since he was a teenager, he called it home without hesitation. One afternoon, as Aidan and Nolan sat side by side repairing the tackroom door, Nolan looked up. I read them, he said. Aidan paused, unsure. The letters, Nolan continued. All of them. After the fire. I found where you burned them. But I remembered every date. I went back to Dallas. Found the copies in your old desk. Aidan didn't speak. His hands trembled slightly. Nolan reached into his coat and pulled one letter from his pocket, worn, folded many times. This one, you wrote it the day Mom died. Aidan took it in silence, his eyes damp. I never knew how to let you in after I lost her, he said quietly. Felt like if I let the grief out, I'd drown in it. Nolan nodded. You didn't have to be strong all the time, Dad. You just had to be real. They sat there a while longer, letting the moment breathe, a father and son, finally speaking the same language after years of silence. That evening, the sky turned golden, and Aidan opened the pen gate. Briggs stepped out slowly, lifting his head toward the open field. You ready? Aidan asked, placing a hand on the horse's shoulder. Briggs didn't run, he walked. Not perfectly, but with purpose. Across the grass, over the scars left by fire and time, toward the horizon. Behind him, Nolan smiled. Think he's finally free? Aidan watched the crooked steps fade into the light. I think we all are. And as the last light of day settled over the Callahan ranch, the wind carried no sorrow, only the sound of second chances, finally taken.